First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for this wonderful event, and especially Aviva for inviting me to talk here. And we've had some great conversations about Kepler, and we hope to continue those as a result of this symposium. Let's see if I can figure out how to make this advance. Yes, it's working. Okay. And I guess Stacy's already remarked on the fact that we have sort of two cultures on the two sides of Euclid Avenue, and it's really awesome to see the humanists with their beautifully written papers. And but on our side of Euclid Avenue, we sort of mumble at the board, and so I'm afraid that's what you're going to get here. But in any case, let's plunge into this story. So what I want to do is I want to talk about Kepler's scientific legacy and his really enduring scientific legacy. And there's a number of ways you can approach that subject. You could talk about his minor works, actually, as a great way to, or what I called his minor works as a way of approaching that. Because, for example, he had this mathematical conjecture about how to stack up cannonballs, and that was proved only in the 1990s, truly an enduring problem. And then there's the relatively new field of pattern formation, which regards Kepler and his snowflake as kind of the beginning of it all. He was also a pioneer of science fiction, as we heard this morning. But what I'm going to focus on is his major work, which is planetary motion. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to delve a little bit into the book we are here celebrating. And it's just amazing to have it right here. So this book, as well as two other books that were part of his major works that you've also heard a little bit about already. So first, let me start by paraphrasing Kepler's laws as we learned them in an introductory physics course. And I should also say that there's a few equations in my talk as we go along. But if you don't like equations, that's OK. There's a sort of essential, irreducible message which you will get, so don't tune out. It'll pass. But I did want the equations up there for people who might want to know in a little more detail what I'm saying. So the laws of Kepler, as we introduced them in introductory physics, are that planets move along elliptical orbits. And an ellipse is just a slightly flattened circle, and it's got these two foci, and the sun sits at one of those foci. So it's characterized by two parameters: the major axis, which is basically the size of the ellipse. That's A, denoted A. And the other important parameter of an ellipse is the eccentricity, which tells you what the shape of the ellipse is. It basically measures how far apart these foci are. So if the eccentricity is 0, it's a circle. But as the eccentricity grows, it becomes more and more squished, the ellipse. So shape and size, that's what describes an ellipse. The second law of Kepler is the law of areas, which just says that if you imagine there's a line connecting the sun to the planet, then when the planet moves, maybe counterclockwise in this picture, this line is going to trace out some area. And the rate at which it traces out area is constant. Or to put it more simply, the planet moves faster when it's close to the sun and slower when it goes farther away. And that's a way of quantifying it. Okay, then the third law of Kepler is the harmonic law. And that basically says that the bigger the orbit is, the farther the planet is from the sun, the longer it takes to go around. And there's a precise mathematical relationship which Kepler found through back-breaking labor to be that t is proportional to a to the 3/2 power. And here I show some new data which confirms that, or the best data that we have today, totally lining up with that within the solar system. Okay, and then finally, so those are the things that we usually emphasize in introductory physics and mechanics courses. There's another really important contribution of Kepler, which somehow doesn't quite get the same amount of airtime, but it should, especially in upper-level physics courses, which is that it's all very well to know that the orbit is an ellipse, but if you want to say where on the ellipse the planet is, that's also a quantity of interest. And there's two ways you can specify where on the orbit the planet is. One is just by giving the angle, which is shown as F in that figure over there. F is the angle between the perihelion, the place where the planet is closest to the sun, and its actual current location. So that's called the true anomaly, and that's one way you can say where the planet is. But then there's also this quantity called the eccentric anomaly, which is a little bit more complicated. The way it works is that you draw a circle, which is what that outer loop is over there in my drawing. You draw a circle which has the same diameter as the major axis of the ellipse, and then you project upward, and the angle that you now get, that's, and actually, I'm sorry, I made that line wrong. That angle should come from the center of the ellipse, not from the location of the sun. That's called the eccentric anomaly. Sorry, that was made very late last night. I think it shows. Okay, but anyway, so the takeaway here is that the eccentric anomaly and the true anomaly, they're just two ways of characterizing where the planet is around the orbit. And the thing is that the eccentric anomaly is the thing that's easy to calculate. There's a simple formula for it, which Kepler discovered. So m over there represents what the angle f would be if the planet was moving at a constant angular velocity around the sun. So that's nice and easy. Oh, probably not near the book. I was just going to put it on a flatter surface, but that's probably the last thing you want me to do. Oh, there's a shelf. Okay, very good. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Right. Okay, so m is the angle that you would have got if it was moving at a uniform angular velocity. And then you can calculate the eccentric anomaly using that equation. Very easy to do on a pocket calculator, but backbreaking labor for Kepler to solve that equation. But it's nice that there's an equation, and that's what I want you to take away. All right, so that's how we would describe Kepler's laws today in, say, a mechanics course. But how did Kepler describe them? I think it's sort of interesting for a modern reader to look into that. And here's this picture of Kepler, which actually might not be Kepler. I mean, we're not absolutely 100% sure that this is him, but it's either him or one of his contemporaries. And here's what he says in the Epitome of Copernican Astronomy, which is written in the form of questions and answers, as Aviva mentioned this morning, or I guess if it had been written today, it might have been called Frequently Asked Questions about Copernican Astronomy. If you look into this book, at first it's actually, it seems very relatable, very contemporary. For example, he has this preface where he says that his previous book, Commentaries on the Movement of the Planet Mars, it was, it sort of buried all the good stuff in thickets of calculation, and also the more delicate readers might have been scared off by the price of the book, and so he's decided to. So it reads like a contemporary preface, and that's the reason why he's writing this book, The Epitome of Copernican Astronomy. But then within this book, and then when you look within this book, you do find Kepler's three laws. They're a little bit buried, and maybe I won't read through all of it, but I just wanted to get the impression that it is really in this question-answer format. And if you look, you begin to find, you do find all the three laws. So there's, in book 4, you find the harmonic law, answered in response to a question. In book 5, you find the law of ellipses, which is not stated in a very catchy way where I could pull a quote from it, but in the course of a few wordy paragraphs, I think Stacy alluded to the fact that they were more wordy back then than we are now in physics and astronomy. But he, in response to this question, he ultimately divulges that they are ellipses, and with the sun at the focus. And then you find also the area law stated as well, again, not in a catchy way that I could pull as a short quote, but there's a section over here with the section header I've provided you. And then you find the anomaly equation as well, and that's in response to a question asking, how do you work out the anomaly? And the answer is, you use the anomaly equation, which he presents in the form of an example. So it's all there, and that's great, but what you find as a modern reader going through this book is that it's buried, really, not in thickets of calculation, which is fine by me, but it's buried in thickets of questions and speculations along these lines. Well, you can read that question for yourself. But so at this point you might think, okay, so this isn't really science. He was just some kind of transitional figure, as I think we heard him described earlier. But in fact, I guess I'd like to delve a little bit more into this question that he raises over here. First of all, I want to point out, as others have done also, that this was very much of the times, the notion that there's somehow music associated with the movement of the stars and planets, as you find in this quote from Shakespeare as well, which is actually exactly contemporaneous with the first edition of this book. But really hidden behind that question that Kepler was asking about which planet is which singer, hidden behind that are these two questions. Why are there 6 planets? And what is the explanation for the sizes and shapes of their orbits? Okay. Now, these we know today are completely misguided questions. There's nothing inevitable about the shapes and sizes of the planets' orbits. And there's nothing inevitable about the fact that there are 6 planets. It could have been completely different. But we have the benefit of hindsight. So it's really not at all unreasonable of Kepler to have asked these questions at the time. And for comparison, so this is actually a constant struggle in science, trying to figure out what are the questions we're allowed to ask, what questions actually have meaningful answers. And so here I've put up some problems of particle physics, which particle physicists are constantly preoccupied with, such as, why are the masses of the elementary particles so small? Why do they have the values that they do? Why is gravity so weak compared to the other forces that Jesse was telling us about this morning? Why is the cosmological constant so small? This is the thing that determines the accelerating expansion of the universe. Or why does space appear to be three-dimensional? And the fact is that when we do find the answers to these questions, they may not be what we expect. And they may not take the form that we expect. And these questions may, well, we'll have to see what happens. So in other words, there's nothing wrong with Kepler asking those questions at the time. Also, he was guided by geometry and musical harmony and so on. Well, so are modern physicists. I mean, some of the guiding principles that are explicitly cited are symmetry and naturalness, which actually have a precise mathematical meaning, but also beauty. There's this quote by Dirac that physical laws must have mathematical beauty. So in some ways, things are really not that different. Okay, so now onto the book. So we heard, again, this morning from Aviva, but for people who weren't here, perhaps, in this book, one of the main hypotheses that Kepler put forward, one of his big ideas over here was that you could understand the relative sizes of planetary orbits from the Platonic solids. You sort of put the Platonic solids one inside the other, and then from the size of a sphere that you can circumscribe the solid with or inscribe within the solid, and the 6 spheres you can put inside inside and outside 5 solids. That explains why there are 6 planets. And you can also get the sizes more or less right. But it's not exactly right, and Kepler was really, really details-oriented, so he realized it wasn't exactly right. But he was happy that he got 6 planets out of this. But later on, he also realized that the orbits are not circular, so it's not just a matter of predicting the size. You must also explain the shape. And so that's where the idea of consonance came in, of musical harmonies came in the book, The Harmonies of the World. And so he began to consider quantities like this. He looked at a given planet, and he looked at when it was moving fastest, when it's close to the sun, and when it's moving slowest, when it's far from the sun. And he would take the ratio of those angular velocities, those angular velocities. And here's a nice problem for the physics students in the audience. You can show that ratio is related to the shape of the orbit, to the eccentricity by the formula I've provided over there. So what he did was he calculated what these ratios were. And what he found is that they're pretty close to these integer ratios. For example, for Saturn, it's 4:5. And that ratio of frequencies in music theory of the day, or for that matter today as well, it's an important interval in music, and it's a consonant interval. And so this was another aha moment for Kepler. He thought that if these ratios come out to be integers that are particularly favored in music, then maybe those orbit shapes would also be favored by nature. That was his idea. Of course, it's completely wrong, but that was the idea in a nutshell. Now, the strange thing is that there's an echo of that idea that has reappeared in the 20th century in quantum mechanics. So I want to move forward about 300 years now and look at this atom as we understood it in the early 20th century. And what was realized at the time was that it was like a miniature solar system. If you look at the simplest atom, hydrogen, then the proton is kind of like the sun at the center of the system, and the electron is like a planet going around the nucleus, or the proton. And gravity is replaced by electrical forces, which have exactly the same behavior. They have the inverse square fall off with distance. So in fact, you get exactly the kind of motion. In fact, electrons would obey Kepler's laws, all 3 of the laws, all of the laws, including the anomaly equation. Same equations, same solutions. And then Here's the remarkable thing. If you look at the spectra of atoms, like, for example, hydrogen over there, when you make hydrogen into a vapor and it glows, it gives off very specific frequencies. And each atom has its own characteristic frequencies, but it doesn't give a continuous spectrum like you see in the lower picture, which is a more dense body. It's actually the entire sun, and it's glowing. That gives off a complete spectrum. But if you're looking at individual atoms radiating, they really have these preferred frequencies. And so the way this was understood in the early 20th century by people like Bohr and Sommerfeld was that this implied that, or maybe I should stay on this slide for a minute. What this implied was that orbits, these orbits in an atom, couldn't be just any shape or size whatsoever, as they can be in the solar system. They had to be particular shapes and sizes. They were quantized. And so what they found, and Kepler would have loved this, what they found is that the orbits could be labeled by two integers. Kepler loved whole number ratios, and here they are, two whole numbers called the principal and angular momentum quantum number. And the size of the orbits is given by the first formula. This is not actually how Bohr and Sommerfeld expressed the quantization rules, but you can rework them into a form that Kepler would have liked. What they were saying is that the size of the orbit goes like n squared, and the shape of the orbit is given by the other formula involving the two quantum numbers. You can also calculate that harmonic ratio, which was just one of I just used that for illustration. There were many different quantities that Kepler calculated involving pairs of planets as well. But if you calculate that ratio of eccentricities, there's one sort of slight fly in the ointment. It does depend on two integers, but it's an irrational number. And Kepler had a sort of irrational dislike of those numbers. Still, it's remarkable how this has echoed Kepler's vision. But it actually gets even better than that, because that's actually just a kind of ad hoc temporary theory we had of the atom. Our full theory requires me to give you a very short introduction to waves in just 3 slides. So first, here's a picture of a wave, the most visual kind of wave imaginable. You throw a stone into a pond, you get these circular ripples. Now, if you want to describe them mathematically, well, you could start with making a schematic diagram. And the diagram actually looks just like the real picture. Those circles are what are called wave fronts. They're just the places where the water has risen to the maximum. And then these wave fronts, these circles, that's a snapshot, they're going to move outward. So you can draw lines perpendicular to the wave fronts. Those are the rays. And those lines tell you which way the wave front is moving. You can also do this with equations, but the pictures are pretty good too. A wave consists of these wave fronts and rays. Now, there's a subject called ray optics, in which you forget about the wavefronts and you just focus on the rays. And you can do a pretty good description of light just by thinking about, or of a wave, just by focusing on the rays. And Kepler was actually one of the pioneers of ray optics. He didn't actually know that lurking behind the rays, they were waves, but he had this idea that the light travels along these rays. And here's one of the diagrams from his book on optics, where he shows how the rays pass through a lens. And here's a diagram from my 100-level physics course, lecture notes, very similar to what Kepler was doing. And this is, again, an example of how Kepler's minor works are just so incredible, too. He explained the workings of the eye, of the camera obscura, of the telescope, and so on, using ray optics. But the thing about ray optics that I want to tell you is that it doesn't always work. And ray optics doesn't work, and the full wave nature of the wave matters. The wave fronts also begin to matter. You need to take them into account. When your wave passes through some small obstruction, when the obstruction is small compared to the wavelength of the wave, like shown in this beautiful picture of ocean waves passing through a small gap in a barrier, then the waves diffract, they begin to spread out, and you need a full wave picture. Okay, there's one more thing I need to tell you about waves, and then we can move on to, we can return to Kepler's harmonies, which is that waves could be either traveling, like the waves in the pond when you throw a stone, because that's an open medium and they just go on forever. But you could also have waves on, like in a musical instrument, like a violin string. If it's clamped at both ends, the waves can't go, they bounce back, and they're trapped just to the violin string. Now, if you pluck it carefully, you can produce these pure notes, which look like this, these sort of classic modes, which have their own characteristic frequencies. So when you have confined waves, you have these characteristic frequencies and waves. Okay, now here's one of the most inspired ideas, inspiring also, but definitely one of the most inspired ideas of modern science. Schrodinger had this idea that matter or electrons were also waves. And all these orbits that we'd spent years talking about for particles, they were just the rays of the waves that we were unaware of. Just like Kepler thought light propagated along those rays and didn't realize that they were wave fronts and that it was a wave, so also with matter. And that's the wave-particle duality that Jesse referred to. So he wrote down an equation that included the wave fronts as well as the rays. And his point was that within an atom, because atoms are small, it's like that ocean wave passing through a small barrier, you need the full wave description. And so in an atom, what you've got is a standing wave, just like the vibrations of a musical instrument. So also, when you have electrons in an atom, they vibrate, and they're just the standing wave modes of the atom. And so it is really very directly connected to music in some sense. The states of the hydrogen atom are standing waves of characteristic frequencies. And it turns out that those Bohr-Sommerfeld ellipses are, in fact, just the rays that underpin this wave picture. OK, so then I want to move on. And in the couple more minutes that I have, I want to come back now from the atom to the solar system. And just catch you up on what's happened since this book in the last 400 years. Obviously, we have a very different view of the solar system now. The planets are not little points of light anymore, as you can see from this Mars-scape over there. Now, nothing kills your theory of why there are 6 planets better than the discovery that there's a 7th planet. Okay, and this is what happened, not in Kepler's lifetime, but in 1781. This was found more or less by chance. Actually, it's a mystery why it wasn't found earlier, because you can see it without a telescope. But the planet Uranus was discovered, and so it became the 7th planet. A much more interesting discovery story, though, is of the 8th planet, which is Neptune. And for this, I need to back up and tell you about Newton, who came up with, well, everybody knows the story, so I can move through this pretty quickly. He came up with this idea that there's a force, and he came up with mechanics. And then he analyzed the problem of just the sun and one other planet, and he was able to derive Kepler's laws out of his mechanical equations. And so this was an amazing feat. And here you see a portrait of Newton by Blake as a mechanical god of the universe. Actually, I don't think he liked Newton very much, so it's not meant to be flattering, but nonetheless. Okay, so. But the problem that Newton did not solve is, what happens if you have something besides just the sun and another planet? What then? Which is what we really have. We have all these planets. Well, so there were these other giants of mathematics and physics that are named at the bottom of that slide over there. So you start from Kepler's picture. An orbit is characterized by 6 parameters. A planet is characterized by 6 parameters. There's the major axis, which is the size of the orbit, the eccentricity, which is the shape, the anomaly, which tells you where you are on the orbit. But the orbit can also be rotated around in space and reoriented. And so there's 3 Euler angles, as they're called, which tell you how the orbit is oriented. So there are 6 parameters that tell you exactly what's going on with the planet. And in Kepler's model, or in Newton's, if you ignore planetary perturbations, then the only thing that changes is the anomaly. The planet goes around the orbit, but the orbit stays fixed in space. But what these guys, Lagrange and Euler and others, not Euler, sorry, Lagrange, Gauss, Hamilton, and others, what they showed is that under the influence of each other, the planet orbits slowly move, and they wrote down some equations describing how they move. Okay, and using that, they were able to predict. There were some problems with the way the orbit of Uranus was moving, even when you took these perturbations into account. And what they found is that the way to explain that was to hypothesize that there's another planet. And so these guys named over there in 1846 predicted that this planet existed. They predicted where on the sky it should be. And pretty much the same day, I think within 24 hours, it was found, the planet Neptune. So that's very impressive indeed. Of course, it didn't look like that back then, but as I said, it's amazing what you can do in 400 years. So there've been a couple of false alarms as well. There were some anomalies in the orbit of Mercury around that time, but it turned out this time that our theory of gravity was wrong. And in fact, Einstein's theory of gravity explains those anomalies in the orbit of Mercury. And then there were some anomalies in the orbit of Uranus and Neptune that emerged as well as they were observed more and more closely. And those led to the discovery of Pluto, but that was an accident because Pluto is far too small to be perturbing Uranus and Neptune. And it's not really a planet after all. But what really happened over here was that these anomalies disappeared as better data came along. In the 1990s, we found there was never an anomaly. So the question remains, is there a ninth planet? And here, what we're looking at is what's called the Kuiper Belt, which is all these icy chunks, including Pluto, that exist beyond the orbit of Neptune. This is, of course, just an artist's conception, but it's a very nice image. So I couldn't resist putting it up. So this is what it looks like. You've got these icy chunks over there. Thousands of them have been observed. Maybe there's millions of them out there. But lurking within them, is there a large planet as well? Well, within the last few years, there's some growing evidence that there might be a ninth planet as well. So this seems like an interesting thing, something that would interest Kepler. He was always interested in knowing how many planets there are. What you see in this data over here is the orbits of about a dozen of these outer Kuiper Belt objects. You should focus on the ones that are in purple. And what's remarkable is that all these orbits kind of line up with each other, kind of like those arrows that Jesse was showing lining up in the morning. They don't line up so well, but compare that to being totally random. They are somewhat aligned, and that's the evidence we have. I meant to talk about our work in this area as well, but I realized I'm out of time, and I realized that yesterday also, so I've left that out. But there may be there might be Planet 9, but with my collaborator Kate Brown, we have some work in progress that I was just telling Stacy about recently, which may connect to what he was saying about the anomalies in galaxy rotation as well. So we're very excited about that work, but I'm going to move on and close out with telling you about why the Kepler Space Telescope is named after Kepler. And it's not merely because he's a great scientist, although, of course, that's a good enough reason, but it's also because of some work that Kepler did, which is perhaps one of his more minor works, but is still really remarkable. So I need to tell you a little bit about this book, the Rudolphine Tables, which we heard about from Aviva this morning also. This is not one of his minor works. In fact, he calls it my chief astronomical work. And it was back-breaking labor to produce this book. He worked on it on and off for about 20 years. What it includes is tables of Brahe's data. It includes, but it also includes, and this is what's heartbreaking to see, tables of logarithms that he painstakingly computed himself, tables of solutions to that anomaly equation, like pages and pages of that stuff, which you could do in, like, with a keystroke. On your phone. And then there are instructions and examples in Latin on how to use these tables. But what these tables do is they implement the system that Kepler had developed for predicting planetary positions. And to show off what you could do with it, what Kepler did was he calculated transits of Mercury. He figured that Mercury might sometimes pass in front of the sun, and so he calculated when that might next happen. And somebody else, using the same tables, also predicted the next transit of Venus. And these things were observed, and they happened exactly as Kepler's tables foretold. So this was historically very important. I guess we don't care that much about transits, but it's still kind of fun when they happen. Some of you might remember there was a transit of Venus in 2012. There was actually a pair of them. They come in pairs. So there was one in 2004, one in 2012, and the next one's going to be 100 years later. So it's always 100 years, 8 years, 100 years, 8 years. That's how they're spaced. So if you didn't see it, I guess you missed your chance. Yeah, but there's some of us in Strosacker viewing it, and here's what it looked like if you had a space probe to observe it. Okay, so the thing about the transits is, if there are planets around other stars, and of course there are, we now know that, so once in a while they would pass in front, in fact, rather frequently, they would pass in front of that star, and so the light of that star should dim. Well, that should happen if we happen to be in the plane of the orbit, and that's not very likely. So if you look at a typical star, even if it has planets, they are unlikely to actually pass in front of it. But if you look at enough stars, and that's why I call this mission improbable. If there are enough stars, you will see these transits, and that's what the Kepler mission does. It looks for these little dips, and it infers the existence of planets. And now we know of thousands of planets, such as this one over here, which is like Luke Skywalker's homeworld in orbit around 2 stars. And so this is really quite incredible. I think one of the most exciting things that's happened in our lifetimes. I guess I'm going to end by letting Kepler have the last word, which is, as you sort of wonder what he would have made of all of this, of what we understand about the universe today. And of course, we don't know what he would have thought about it. But it's clear he was very open-minded, because this is what he says about the evolution of his own ideas from this book to the harmonies of the world, that things happen not in the mode wherein I had conceived it in my mind, and this is not last in my joy, but in a very different mode that is also very excellent and very perfect. And so I hope he would also consider what we've now discovered very excellent and very perfect. And I guess I'm going to stop here. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that there's a precise mathematical meaning to naturalness. Can you say a little more about that?
Yes. So this is actually going over to particle physics. And just to repeat the question for people who might be streaming, Chris just asked me to elaborate on the technical meaning of naturalness. And so the point is that if you look at the parameters that go into the standard model of particle physics, there are three of them. There's Planck's constant, there's the speed of light, and then there's Newton's constant, g. And if you combine them, you can figure out that the natural mass scale is something called the Planck mass, which is much bigger than the masses of elementary particles. And that's puzzling, because it turns out that this kind of analysis normally that you do, where you think about all the parameters and you try to make up something which has the right units, it's called dimensional analysis. It usually works extremely well. And very often, you can predict what the answer to a question is going to be using just dimensional analysis. And then you spend all your time doing detailed calculations just to, get more precise answers. But you can get the right ballpark estimate at least. And so here's a case where the ballpark estimate is, dozens of orders of magnitude off. But naturalness is the idea that that things should follow this kind of analysis, and when they don't, you have to try to explain that. It's a little bit more technical than that, because then you have to, within the context of quantum field theory, if things don't quite line up, that's okay. What you have to worry about is whether quantum effects, do they tend to drive things towards lining up in this way with dimensional analysis, or do they not? And so if your answer is way off dimensional analysis, but it's somehow stable to quantum fluctuations, then again, you can declare that that's natural. But so let me give you a concrete example again with the masses of the elementary particles. They're very light compared to the Planck mass. There's nothing that can be done about that. Actually, particle physicists are very creative. There's something that can be done about that too. But let's work with models where nothing can be done about that. So what you can do is you can create models, and these are models called supersymmetry, where you introduce a partner to every particle, in which, although these masses are very different from what they should be, that's okay. If they are over there, they'll stay there, and you don't need to worry about it. So that's the kind of naturalness arguments that particle physicists use. And that's why they believe in supersymmetry, and that's why machines like the Super Collider, which we saw pictures of, it's the biggest machine humanity has ever built. They're built on this faith that naturalness is guiding us to these supersymmetric partners, and we must look for them. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
You put up a list of questions that were bothering physicists that were kind of in the same family as the question of why there are 6 planets. And I remember when Steven Weinberg came here, he stated that the Standard Model could not be complete because it doesn't explain why the properties of the particles take the values that they do. What is the bottom for this exercise? I mean, is there some point at which physicists are like, oh, okay, now we're good? The nature of the question just seems like there's always another layer that that you could ask. So,
Yeah. So I think the answer to that question is no, we'll never be satisfied. The short answer to that question. But because you always want to understand more, and I don't think you can arrive at a final theory. Even though people have talked about final theories, and physicists have, but I don't think that's really possible. But yes, I don't want to get in trouble here, so I want to be careful to say I'm not necessarily saying explaining the pattern of masses is like explaining why there are 6 planets. But it could turn out to be like that. We really don't know what type of question it is. We may find an explanation for why there's that pattern, and that would be really exciting. But it might also turn out it's just that way, and there's no explanation, no better explanation. Some people think that's like admitting defeat, and I think Steven Weinberg does think that. If you say that these masses are just whatever they are, you're giving up, you're not doing science anymore. But I don't think that's really right. I think what will happen is that either we'll explain the pattern of masses, or we'll realize it's not really a meaningful question, but it won't just be, it won't stop being meaningful because we've given up. But it's because of the new theory that emerges. Within that, we'll see that it's not a useful question. In the same way that Kepler's question became, we realized it wasn't a meaningful thing to ask because there was nothing special about those sizes. And that's just an evolutionary detail of the solar system.
I mean, it does sound though like if you're going through that process, that there's nothing can come out to be just a contingent fact. Like there's no accident.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that really how people think?
That's sort of the dream, but yeah. Yeah. But I guess there's levels of contingency, right? Like I think we do demand of people who model the origins of the solar system that they should make it seem natural, that it's more or less flat. And the fact that all the orbital elements are such that they all lie in the same plane. We don't want to explain exactly what the inclination angles of different planets are, like Kepler would have wanted to do, but we want to explain that they're all more or less the same inclination and they're all more or less in the same plane. Yeah. But with the standard model, with the particles, we really want, ideally, to have, to 10 places, 10 decimal places what the masses are. If we could do that, I think we'd be very happy. Okay, go ahead.
So in the 20th century with mathematics, it sort of came about that you can't describe everything with mathematics. So sort of on the same lines, do you think getting to a grand theory that describes everything, like saying why the masses are, is achievable within physics?
Yeah, I think that is the problem, right? We don't know. I think you've sort of put in focus the same point I was trying to make, that that we don't really know what questions are good questions and are answerable. We only know that in hindsight, and you never have hindsight. Others do. Yeah. So I wonder if, in light of the time, we should wrap up here, and people can grab coffee before the panel. All right. Well, thanks everyone for your attention.